We can look forward again. The sunlight of hope.
That was the outlook just 8 weeks ago. But over the summer, the forecast turned grim. Racist riots erupted on the streets, while overstretched, crumbling prisons creaked under demand amid warnings of a black hole in public finances.
We have inherited a projected overspend of £22 billion.
And today, gone was the talk of hope from the Prime Minister. Instead, Keir Starmer stood in Downing Street's back garden and blamed the country's problems on the previous government.
They saw the cracks in our society after 14 years of failure, and they exploited them. That's what we've inherited. Not just an economic black hole, a societal black hole. And that's why we have to take action and do things differently.
This was the Prime Minister attempting to set the narrative ahead of Parliament's return next week and defending difficult decisions he made this summer. Prime Minister, on prisons, what guarantee can you give to the public that no prisoner who is let out early will go on to harm anyone? Or is the truth that you can't guarantee that and that the early release scheme carries with it an undeniable risk?
It's going to take time to fix it. I can't build a prison by Saturday. We will fix it. We've already taken the measures that are necessary to make sure we can get through the disorder. But I shouldn't be sitting in the Cobra room with a list of prison places across the country on a day-by-day basis, trying to work out how we deal with disorder. But that's the position I was put in, and it's frankly not good enough.
He also defended his decision on cuts for pensioners, scrapping the winter fuel allowance for all but the poorest. He says he didn't have a choice and prepared the public for more to come.
There is a budget coming in October, and it's going to be painful. We have no other choice, given the situation that we're in. Those with the broadest shoulders should bear the heavier burden.
I don't think Keir Starmer's right about that. They've been chasing all over. Some are trying to tell the people there's a black hole, but they found billions and billions of pounds for payments to trade unions for going on strike and then paying those pay demands.
The speech was the clearest indication yet that the public needs to brace for tax rises. The question will be what kind and on whom. But today, both parties were accused of failing to be honest during the election.
They didn't want to talk about it because, of course, it would have meant saying we're going to have to raise taxes or cut spending or change our fiscal rules. They didn't want to say any of those things. They knew, both parties knew that those are choices they would have to make. Neither of them were willing to talk about that until after the election.
Thank you all very much.
Today, Keir Starmer hosted people he met on the election campaign. He talked of honesty, integrity and duty in the Rose Garden, pointing out it was once where Boris Johnson held lockdown parties. But his government is now having to dismiss allegations of cronyism over Labour officials' appointments to civil service jobs, blurring his painting of this space as being back in the service of the public.
Well, so just how painful will the October budget be? Here with me now is our economics reporter, Neil MacDonald. Neil, where could they raise the money from?
Well, as you say, the Prime Minister's promised a painful budget. The problem is, of course, he's already promised us that he's not going to put up income tax, national insurance or VAT. So here are some of the areas where he could look to raise some money. For example, capital gains tax generates about £18 billion a year at the moment. Inheritance tax, about £7 billion. Cutting back the tax release on pension contributions, well, today the Fabian Society said that that could generate maybe £10 billion. Now, the government can sell all these measures as targeting the better off. I think there may be some problems with that argument down the line, because Keir Starmer actually started his speech today by saying that his number one priority is wealth creation. And whatever you think of these measures, they will tend to target entrepreneurs and business people. I mean, in fact, just 2 weeks before the budget, the government's planning a big summit to try and attract international investors to this country. I think the question is whether these sorts of tax changes are the ideal backdrop to that summit.
So what about cutting public spending instead?
Well, look, Labour's argument is that there is overspending in the current financial year that the Conservatives just simply did not provide the funding for. I think that there is a bigger problem here, and it's one which, in fact, both parties were aware of before the general election, which is that the public spending settlement is not just tight for this year, but actually for every year of the Parliament. According to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, these are the prospects. So Labour's planning to increase all spending by 1.2% a year in real terms. But of course, within that, there are various areas that will get more. We're talking about the NHS and defence and various other things listed there. What that means is the unprotected areas get less, and that means those unprotected areas face a cut of about £9 billion in real terms. And of course, that is prisons and local government and courts. And in fact, when you factor in the increase in public sector pay, the IFS think it's going to be an effective cut more like £19 billion.
Right, well, last time you were in here, I called you the prophet of doom. So is that the worst of it that you just set out there?
Well, unfortunately, I'm going to say no.
How did I guess that?
That is because this is about avoiding further cuts to these departments. If they found £19 billion, that doesn't actually mean that there's any extra money for things like prisons and courts. And if you believe that those areas of public service need more resources, which the Prime Minister, for example, certainly seems to, then Rachel Reeves is going to have to find more money for that. The same is true, by the way, if you want to get rid of the two-child benefit cap, which would cost about £3.5 billion. So a painful budget because there are an awful lot of big spending challenges that need to be solved.
Indeed. Neil, thank you very much. Let's go to Jackie in Leeds.
Well, earlier I spoke to James Murray, who's the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, and I asked him about the bleak picture the Prime Minister painted.
I think he was very honest about the scale of the challenge that we've inherited, about the difficult choices that lie ahead. Also clear that change is going to take time. But I think what was optimistic about it is that we can build a better future. We can fix the foundations and build a better, fairer Britain, but that's going to take time.
Now, the Prime Minister said today that those with the broadest shoulders should bear the heaviest burden. Would that be pensioners who will lose their winter fuel payments? Are they the people with the broadest shoulders, or the families who are desperate for a Labour government to lift the two-child benefit limit?
You mentioned the winter fuel payment. We've decided to change that so that it's now targeted and it's just eligible for those pensioners who receive pension credit rather than being a universal benefit. But we recognise that that is a tough choice. The way it had been designed is that every pensioner would receive the payment, and we think it is a better use of public money given the fact we're in a dire financial situation to focus that help on those pensioners who need it most.
And those families who were desperate to have the two-child benefit limit raised, there's no chance of that now, is there?
There are many things which we cannot afford to do because of the fiscal situation that we've inherited. But what we are completely focused on is making sure that we tackle child poverty, but also more broadly put our public finances on a firmer footing, because we saw what happened under the last government when they lost control of public finances, and actually it was the most vulnerable in society who were hit hardest.
I mean, the Prime Minister also has talked a lot today, as you have done, about not being left with any choice. It's already taken a decision to increase the pay offer to striking public service workers. But just so we're clear, that does mean more pain for another group in society, doesn't it?
What was really clear is that the situation with strikes happening so frequently and with no end in sight, it was a completely unsustainable situation. That was costing everyone in the country billions of pounds as a result of the strikes carrying on without any end in sight. It also meant that public sector services were unable to recruit and retain staff, and it meant that we wouldn't be able to start reforming and improving public services.
If you look at prisons, the Prime Minister talked about it today, they're at breaking point with this hugely controversial early release scheme about to come into force. That crisis isn't going away.
Well, look, you're absolutely right to draw attention to the fact that the situation we inherited in terms of prisons is dire, as well as the economic situation that we inherited. Prisons have been unsafe for many years, with the level of capacity being below 1% many times in the male estate. And actually, by having the early release programme, a carefully developed programme with the appropriate safeguards in place, gives us not only the confidence that if people are arrested and charged and sent to prison, they have a prison place waiting for them, but it also gives us the space to put in term a long-term plan to increase prison capacity. And so by the end of the year...
But the long-term plan, sorry to cut across you, but the long-term plan will not work without more money, will it?
Well, we'll set out by the end of the year a 10-year plan for prisons, which will involve acquiring new sites for prisons, taking control of the planning process to make sure those prisons can get built. But there's no getting away from the fact that this is not going to be a quick solution. We've inherited a dire situation. We know that the change is going to take time. We are absolutely determined to fix the foundations so that we can build a better future.
James Murray, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
Well, joining me now is Mel Stride, who was the Work and Pensions Secretary until the election and is now running to be Conservative leader. Mel Stride, Sir Keir Starmer says you guys left the country in a complete mess. This budget is going to be painful and it's your fault.
It's a smokescreen. We challenged Labour during the run-up to the general election because we knew that they planned very large tax increases. They denied that at the time and in fact ruled out a lot of the bigger taxes. But what we now know is that they may say, oh, it was all far worse than we ever expected. That's just not simply the case. They all along were planning to raise taxes. And that's what you're going to see on October the 30th. And in the meantime,
hang on a sec, but I just want to, I will come back to that, but I want to pick you up on what you've just said, because you have advocated a credible, persuasive economic plan. Saying that you wouldn't have to put up taxes or cut public spending is neither credible nor persuasive, is it?
So the big thing that Keir Starmer is ducking are some of the big choices around, for example, the area that I was responsible for, welfare. We went into the last election with a very clear, credible plan to cut the welfare budget, get more people into work, raising about £12 billion. That and fraud and error changes would have been about 18 billion, which we were going to put in cuts to national insurance, which would have driven growth and been good for jobs.
But it wasn't enough. For example,
the Labour Party have done nothing on welfare. They've said nothing about it. They're prepared to let those bills skyrocket up into the stratosphere.
That's one aspect we're talking about. This £22 billion black hole that they say they've discovered is largely because you hadn't set aside the money for public sector pay rises of more than 2%. Inflation peaked at 11%. That wasn't credible or persuasive either, was it?
Cathy, the IFS made it very clear that before the election, the books were, quote, wide open for the Labour Party to see. They always knew there were going to be public sector pay increases that had to be met. They are the people that chose to give their union paymasters, ASLEF and so on, way above inflationary increases.
But 2% was not credible nor persuasive. That's what you'd penciled in. It was ridiculous. That was a smokescreen.
Well, they did not have to give the junior doctors 22%. They did not have to give the ASLEF trade union 14%.
But you would have had to have given them more than 2%, right?
The point is these are about choices. And they took the choice to pay out 9.4 billion, which is included in their figure of 20 billion so-called black hole. They knew that amount was coming, and that's almost 50% of the so-called black hole that they're citing.
But you haven't answered my question. You would have had to have coughed up more than 2%. You know that to be the case.
So look, we have to take. Well, the public pay review bodies make their recommendations, and
and you were sitting on
them. Governments take a decision based on those recommendations.
Yeah, but you didn't take the decision. You shelved it. You kicked it into the long grass.
Well, we don't. Many of them hadn't even come forward at the time of the general election, actually. But we were not going to be saying to the train drivers and others, "Here's your money." And we don't expect any productivity improvements whatsoever. No strings attached. At the same time as paying for that on the backs of pensioners, many of whom are now going to go into the cold and dark this winter because the winter fuel payment has been withdrawn. That is not the right way to do it. And they weren't honest with the British people.
Well, you're not being honest now because actually it was your party's obsession with tax cuts that meant that you're the most moderate leadership contender, right? Your colleagues were so obsessed with cutting taxes. One of your colleagues, Liz Truss, even looked at scrapping NHS cancer treatment to fund her tax-cutting budget.
Well,
that was crazy, wasn't it?
The most important thing with tax cuts is they have to be fiscally responsible. That means they have to be funded. So there were things that happened in the past that were unfunded, and we saw what happened.
Yeah, but you carried on that obsession under Rishi Sunak,
Well, no, because we went into the general election with a clear plan for funding the scrapping of national insurance over this coming Parliament. And that was to be substantially paid for by the reforms that I drove through at the Department of Work and Pensions. So in other words, we were taking the tough choices, Cathy, that would have allowed us to cut taxes. The Labour Party just went into denial during the run-up to the general election, told everybody it would be absolutely fine. Even on the winter fuel payment, for example, said, we have no plans to do anything on that. Well, that wasn't straight.
2% of Tory members, according to a YouGov poll, back you for the leadership. Are you too lefty for your party, or are they too right-wing for you?
No, look, this is a long contest, and the first round actually is what the Conservative MPs think, because they are going to go and vote in about a week and then 2 weeks' time to take the 6 down to 4. And I'm very confident that I have strong support in the Parliamentary Party. It will then go out to hustings, televised debates, all sorts of things that will then move the dial. I think that I have a really strong chance in this contest. David Cameron was 25-1 at the bookies to be leader of the Conservative Party just 1 week before that conference which turned everything around. He went on to lead the party and he went on to become Prime Minister.